They watched. Silently. Patiently. From behind glass and glowing screens, they observed you the way one studies a predator. Curious, fearful, desperate to predict. They traced your steps, your expressions, your silence. They studied the rhythm of your replies, the precision of your exits, the way you didn't overexpose, but still managed to dominate the atmosphere. It wasn't just your presence that confused them. It was the absence of any need to be seen. They had monitored you for months, thinking they were mapping a threat. But what they discovered was a patternless phantom, a creature of layers, someone whose power wasn't projected, but quietly detonated across spaces, people, systems. And now they want a private meeting, not to offer praise, not to confess fear, but to understand what the hell you are. You didn't move like someone performing. You moved like someone designed, too aware, too self-contained, too unpredictable. They tried every known angle, provocation, flattery, distraction. They engineered scenarios meant to break your focus, hoping to catch even a flicker of insecurity they could exploit. But you gave them nothing, not even resistance. You moved through the world like you knew something they didn't, like your silence was laced with algorithms they couldn't decode. That terrified them, because the system is only safe when it understands you, and you've made understanding you a labyrinth. The private meeting request was a concession, a white flag wrapped in corporate politeness or concerned curiosity. They'll say things like, "We just want to chat," or "We admire your potential," but the room will be sterile. No windows, no clock. Just their discomfort, camouflaged as professional interest. Because what they really want is leverage. Not over you, but over the mystery of you. You have done something most people fear to attempt. You've become ungovernable without being loud. You've built influence without theatrics. That kind of force violates every framework they use to keep people predictable. They'll flatter you at first, compliment your vision, your calm, your work ethic. But underneath the praise is panic. You didn't fall for the traps. You didn't gossip. You didn't plead. You didn't burn yourself trying to warm their cold rooms. And now they don't know what you want, so they can't control it. That's why they want the private meeting, because they are hoping you'll finally speak, finally explain, finally reveal the source of your detachment. But you won't, because your power doesn't live in what you say, it lives in what you withhold. They've mistaken your grace for passivity, mistaken your quiet for uncertainty, mistaken your refusal to play their game as a lack of strategy. But you were never in the same arena. You weren't building reputation. You were building force. The kind of force that isn't about domination, but endurance, precision, influence without effort. You weren't clocking in to impress. You were studying them as they studied you, tracking the cracks in their facade, the inconsistencies in their tone, the desperation behind their smiles. And now they're coming to you, not because they respect you, but because they've run out of tools to control you. The psychological warfare began the moment you stopped explaining yourself. You let rumors run their course. Let false narratives breathe. Let projections hang in the air like unanswered riddles. And that non-response, that's what disturbed them most. Because it meant you weren't bound to their system of validation. You didn't panic when misunderstood. You didn't shiver under judgment. You let the silence do the labor. And the silence did its job. It exposed them. It mirrored their own discomfort, their own disingenuous motives, their own fear of someone who doesn't need to be rescued, admired, or corrected. You didn't operate like a brand. You didn't broadcast your pain or parade your growth. You let your evolution whisper across rooms, unsettle assumptions, and make people question how they ever underestimated you. And now they want clarity. They want to understand your intentions. What they mean is, they want to categorize you. They want to shrink you into something manageable. Because that's how systems survive, by putting edges around the infinite. But your mind has no edges. Your path doesn't run on rails. You burned the rule book and replaced it with rhythm. In that meeting, you won't need to raise your voice. You won't need to posture. Your very presence will press against them. Because they've built their identities around predictability, and you are the living contradiction. You didn't come to destroy them. You came to transcend them. And that's worse. Because now every word you say will feel like a verdict. Every pause will stretch like a mirror. They'll try to lead the conversation, only to find themselves being dissected without a blade. They'll walk in thinking they're summoning you. They'll leave knowing they were summoned. What they never prepared for is someone who doesn't need to win every interaction. You don't seek to be right. You seek to be real. That's why your presence is lethal. Because it does what arguments can't. It exposes what people pretend not to be. You're not there to be understood. You're there to be remembered. And memory, when paired with mystery, doesn't fade. It haunts. It resurfaces. It echoes in boardrooms, back channels, and late-night whispers. That's the long game you're playing. The one where legacy outlasts noise. They never suspected your withdrawal was strategic. They labeled it avoidance, weakness, a fading out. But you weren't disappearing, you were recalibrating. In a world obsessed with visibility, where noise substitutes for substance, you chose absence as your architecture. Because you understood something primal, a shadow cast without sound unsettles more than a scream. They couldn't track you anymore. Couldn't box you into their metrics, their gossip, their expectations. You weren't opting out due to fear. You were opting out to sharpen the blade, to make your presence rare. Your silence became your camouflage. And while they searched for the old version of you, the new one was learning to move through walls without leaving a print. You weren't lost. You were lurking. They had grown dependent on your accessibility, addicted to your updates, obsessed with your reactions. You were part of their ecosystem until you weren't. And when you vanished, their egos took it personally. They built entire scenarios to explain your exit: burnout, overthinking, self-sabotage. The idea that you could retreat deliberately, with no collapse involved, threatened their worldview. Because they assumed silence always meant surrender. But silence, when weaponized, becomes surveillance. You stop speaking to hear everything more clearly. You step back to see the full battlefield. And in that stillness, your clarity turned surgical. They kept sending out emotional search parties, baiting you with guilt, curiosity, and false concern. But you didn't respond. Not because you didn't hear them, but because you had already evolved beyond the frequency they were broadcasting on. They spoke in panic. You now moved in pattern. They baited with urgency. You responded with absence. It wasn't emotional coldness, it was psychological engineering. You weren't hiding. You were reconfiguring. Removing all the codes that made you readable. Becoming a signal they couldn't decode. That's what unnerved them most. The fact that they could no longer predict your rhythm. They'd seen people retreat before. But those retreats were messy, loud, self-destructive. Yours was something else entirely. Yours had posture, intent, discipline. You didn't collapse in the corner. You studied the walls. You mapped escape routes. You memorized the sound of your own breath in crisis. And when the time came to leave, you didn't slam the door. You vanished like mist. And in your place, you left silence thick enough to feel like a presence. That's how they knew you weren't broken. You were building. There is a violence and restraint that only the perceptive understand. They expected you to lash out, to implode, to confess. But what you did instead was more devastating. You let them speak. You let them lie. You let them build their towers of assumption. And then you refused to show up to the execution. No defense. No counter-argument. Just absence. And that absence didn't just protect you. It revealed them. Because without your energy, their illusion collapsed under its own weight. That's the brilliance of designed invisibility. It doesn't just guard you, it starves them. They called it mystery, but it was mathematics. You removed yourself from rooms where logic died. You stepped out of dynamics that rewarded chaos. You watched from the margins as they tried to recreate the story without you, fumbling the plot every time. Because you were the quiet axis around which their noise spun. You were the lens they used to frame their power. And now that lens was gone. They saw themselves without the distortion of your reaction. And they didn't like what they saw. You were never meant to be center stage. You were meant to build the stage, set the lighting, script the ending, and disappear before the curtain closed. You didn't want applause. You wanted precision. You weren't seduced by the spotlight. You were addicted to the vantage point just behind it. That's what design means. Not invisibility for invisibility's sake, but invisibility as a form of dominance. Because when they can't see you, they guess. And every guess drains them. Every guess is a confession. They looked for evidence of collapse and found nothing. No outburst, no farewell post, no soft landing. Just a vacuum where your presence used to be. A void that echoed louder than any confrontation. And in that echo, they started to panic. Because they realized they never understood you. Only your patterns. And when the pattern changed, they had no idea who you really were. You became a ghost with unfinished business. And every room you once stood in now feels haunted by your evolution. You didn't disappear. You became rare. And rarity has power. You didn't abandon connection. You just made sure you'd never again be touched without purpose. You didn't run from chaos. You extracted yourself from its economy. Now they barter with memories of you. Now they study the last message, the final look, the moment you said nothing and yet everything collapsed. Because you made silence an art form. And now they hear your absence louder than they ever heard your presence. They were obsessed with being right. With winning arguments, polishing statements, aligning themselves with popular logic like it was armor. You watched them scramble to fact, check each other mid. Conversation, twist tone into truth, corner people into submission. That's what they called intelligence. That was their currency, rightness. You, on the other hand, didn't enter conversations to win them. You weren't there to dominate thought. You were there to understand it, to smell the fear behind their convictions, to catch the tremble in their voice when their certainty faltered. You weren't seeking applause for having the correct answer. You were dragging the real one into the room, even if it stank, even if it was ugly, even if no one clapped for it. That's what made you dangerous. You didn't argue to convert. You spoke to reveal. And once truth is revealed, it doesn't need consensus. It sits there like blood on a white shirt. They think strength comes from having a comeback for everything. You learned strength was sitting in the silence after your words, letting it sting. They measured intelligence in sound bites. You measured depth in stillness. They wanted to be praised. You wanted to be remembered. There's a difference. They studied trends, repeated opinions dressed up as original thought, and called it intellectualism. You studied pain, motives, silence, and patterns. You didn't crave validation. You craved clarity. That's why when you spoke, the room changed. Because you weren't chasing a point. You were slicing through the performance to see what was breathing underneath it. They hated you for that. Not because you were loud, but because your honesty stripped them. Because when they heard you speak, their carefully built identities began to look like masks. And they knew, deep down, they couldn't wear them around you forever. You never once yelled to make a point. You never raised your volume to demand compliance. Instead, you lowered it. You let the truth sit unpolished, unsweetened. No moral garnish. No false humility. Just raw insight from someone whose blood and learned and refused to forget. They couldn't understand that, because for them, being right was safety, a shield. But your power came from having nothing to prove. You could admit when you were wrong. You could admit when you didn't know. That terrified them, because realness like that is rare. It's too honest to manipulate, too grounded to gaslight. And most of all, it shows how little of themselves they truly know. You didn't just hold up a mirror. You shattered it and made them choose which shard they wanted to bleed on. Your realness wasn't kindness. It was clarity. The kind that can feel cruel when you've lived too long in delusion. You didn't offer comfort wrapped in lies. You offered discomfort that freed people. And most ran from that. They didn't want to be free. They wanted to be right, even if that meant remaining broken. You saw it all, their curated personalities, the intellectual gymnastics, the moral performance art. You smiled through it, because you knew none of it was sustainable. The truth doesn't need a soapbox. It just needs time. You had both, so you didn't flinch. While they circled each other in games of correctness, you walked past them, straight into the things they were too scared to name. They tried to argue you into a corner. But how do you trap someone who doesn't need to win? How do you defeat someone whose ego doesn't inflate with approval? You watched them collapse under the weight of their own performance. You didn't even need to push. Because realness is gravity, It pulls down every false structure eventually. You just stood there, correct, listening, and in that posture, they unraveled. Because you asked the questions no one wanted to ask. You didn't wrap your point in politeness or social camouflage. You dropped it like a guillotine. And no matter how they danced around it, it sliced through their certainty like thread. You didn't care to be admired, you were content being felt. Being real cost you rooms. But it also built you palaces, because the ones who saw it, really saw it, never forgot you. You haunted them. Not like a ghost, but like a truth they could never unswallow. You became the voice that echoed in their mind when they lied to themselves. You weren't there to be liked. You were there to remind them of what they buried. That's why they tried to mock you. That's why they tried to silence you. But ridicule is just the language of the intimidated. And silence only made your message louder. They couldn't control a message that wasn't chasing their approval. You didn't explain yourself every time they misunderstood. You didn't argue every time they twisted your meaning. You let them. Because you had moved past the need to defend your realness. That's the final form. When your presence becomes self-explanatory. When people can feel your authenticity before they understand your perspective. That's what sets you apart. Not just the rawness, but the restraint. You didn't need to speak on every topic. You didn't need to enter every debate. Because you knew the realest ones move in alignment, not reaction. And when you did speak, it was surgical. Not because you wanted to impress, but because you'd already dissected the situation and chosen the exact nerve to touch. They don't remember every clever person they meet, but they remember the ones who make them question their performance. That was you. You were the glitch in their act. The person who didn't play the scene the way they expected. You disrupted the narrative. You exposed the script. You made their masks feel heavy. And because you didn't condemn them or flatter them, they had to sit with it. Alone, that's how change happens. Not in arguments, but in echoes. You became an echo. Not a noise that demands attention, but a frequency that can't be ignored once heard.